Today, the war between Israel and Hamas enters the 18th day. These 2 weeks have seen many developments since the conflict began. But what remained constant was the United States' unwavering support to Israel. From America's top diplomats to the president himself, the United States has left no stone unturned in providing Israel with aid and weapons. But America's blank check to Israel has complicated its own diplomatic ties in West Asia. Take a look.
In his first reaction to the attack on Israel by Hamas, President Joe Biden made clear which side he is on. But since then, the US has faced continuous flack over its support for Israel. Iran President Ibrahim Raisi, who is one of the constant critics of the Biden administration, even accused the United States of being a partner in the crimes of Israel.
موشک‌ها رو از کشورهای منطقه وارد فلسطین اشغالی می‌کنید.
Further, Iran's foreign minister also accused the United States of intensifying and expanding the war in Gaza.
اما آمریکا در 2 هفته گذشته نشان داده و ثابت کرده با ارسال ده‌ها و صدها و هزاران محموله سلاح و حمایت تمام عیار از رژیم صهیونیستی.
So amid all the warnings and threats, the big question remains, to what lengths will the US go to support Israel, and at what cost? Of late, American military troops have been victims of a series of drone attacks. Since Wednesday, at least 5 rocket and drone attacks have targeted 3 Iraqi military bases where American troops are stationed. According to reports, most of the drone attacks were destroyed in the air. While the US accused Iran of actively facilitating these attacks, Iran, on the other hand, has kept mum about the allegations. Warning about the repercussions, US Secretary of State said that Washington is prepared to retaliate if US troops are targeted in the course of the Israel-Hamas war. The United States is Israel's largest military backer, providing about $3.8 billion worth of defense aid a year. Expressing his sympathy with Israeli suffering, Biden vowed to provide an unprecedented additional assistance for Israel worth $14 billion. But the president also cautioned Israel against repeating US mistakes after 9/11 out of rage. In the short term, Israel needs support. Washington is obligated to show strong support as a staunch ally. But with the current attacks, would a US president really be willing to become embroiled in another war, especially in an election year? Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Joining me now to discuss this and a lot more is Morgan Vinas. She is the former Chief of Staff to the US Ambassador at the United Nations, Nikki Haley. Morgan is also the Vice President of Government Affairs at the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. Welcome to the show, Morgan.
Thank you for having me.
Morgan, what do you make of Barack Obama's statement? Is he basically saying what the White House cannot?
Perhaps President Obama should, instead of putting his finger on the scale with respect to this conflict, this is more of a matter of self-reflection, an opportunity for his own self-reflection as we look to the crisis in the Middle East right now. You know, the statement that he provided does not mention Iran once, perhaps because it was his own policy of appeasement that led to Iran's own rise to influence in the region. You know, in 2012, President Obama pursued a policy of appeasement. First, he failed to enforce his own red line when the Iranian-backed Syrian regime used chemical weapons on its own people. And then in 2015, he kicked the nuclear can down the road with respect to Iran's nuclear program and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And so I think really when it comes down to this current crisis, President Obama doesn't really have a lot of credibility when it comes to strategic deterrence for the region.
Morgan, let's talk about the leaders who will be gathering later today at the UN to discuss the war. The situation in Gaza is currently alarming. Will there be any resolution? We know that there is a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza as of now.
Indeed, the humanitarian crisis is very regrettable. I would note that this is the deliberate attempt by Hamas to use civilians as human shields these terrorists relish in the fact that these civilians are suffering. Babies on ventilators are suffering because Hamas refuses to even allow their own people security and move to the south. I think it's really important to note here that the United Nations is a hotbed of anti-Israeli bias. I don't see the United Nations being a solution to this conflict. Calling for a ceasefire right now, and Israel needs to prosecute this war and defend its own people and its territory, I think is inappropriate at this time. The United States and others have said that Israel needs to, they have Israel's back, and Israel needs to take care of this threat against their people on their own schedule.
Right, Morgan, thank you so much for all those insights, and thanks for joining us on Gravitas tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Are the British too snooty to do their own laundry? For almost a century now, the Royal Navy has been employing Chinese servants on warships. What for? To wash their clothes. Since the 1930s, hundreds of Chinese laundrymen have worked on Britain's warships. Most were hired from Hong Kong. They would wash and iron sailors' uniforms, even their white tablecloths. But now the UK is ending this tradition. Why? Amid fears of espionage. The Royal Navy fears that Chinese laundrymen may have been forced to spy for Beijing, that China could threaten the servants' families back home to make those on board ships pass on Royal Navy secrets. These are the same helpers who have fought wars alongside the British Navy. Many have even paid with their lives. Now you would think, with the Chinese servants gone, maybe British officers will deal with their own laundry on their own, or at least employ helpers from their own country. That it would be a wake-up call, a break in the cycle. But let me be clear. That's not the case. It seems it is fellow Britons, rather below Britons, especially those in power, to wash their clothes. The Navy will now employ Nepalese Gorkhas to do the job. On a voyage to the South China Sea, 3 Chinese men were blocked from serving on the HMS Queen Elizabeth, which the Royal Navy's flagship aircraft carrier reports say a 4th Chinese laundryman was also dismissed this month after 39 years of service. Why? Because his family lives in Hong Kong. Only those Chinese nationals whose families have moved to Britain are being allowed to work. Officials say the Navy has no choice but to cut their historic ties with Chinese laundrymen. What is the UK so afraid of? Ken McCallum, the head of the MI5, warns that China is attempting to steal nuclear technology secrets from the UK. By doing so, it wants to disrupt the AUKUS security pact. McCallum has also issued similar warnings over espionage in the past. You see, the Royal Navy wants Asians to do their menial tasks. It wants their servants to look a certain way. But hiring Chinese laundrymen is too big of a risk now. So, it is making do with Gorkhas. You would think that colonialism is behind us. But is it really? Well, the Great Britain never fails to surprise us.